because I know in your book, in the first part of your book, you talk about affirmative action. You talk about some of the past, what had been the precedent on the use of affirmative action in college admissions until last week. And so I am curious, but since then, did you get a chance to look at this new ruling?
Well, the majority opinion and the concurring opinions. The majority opinion was written by Roberts. The concurring opinions were written by Thomas, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh. And then the dissenting opinions were written by Sotomayor and Ketanji Brown Jackson. Elena Kagan signed on to the dissenting opinions, but she didn't write one. And in the majority, Amy Coney Barrett didn't write one. Altogether, it comes to 240 pages. I read it all, and now I'm rereading it because my style is, the first read is just to see where is this argument going, and you don't know where it's going until you're at the end. And the second read is to look at it critically and see what holds together and what doesn't. So I'm in the middle now. I'm near the middle of the second reading. I reread Roberts, I reread Ketanji Brown Jackson, and I'm halfway through Sotomayor, and then I have to get back to Thomas, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh. And it's, I would say, it's a confused picture because in many ways they're talking past each other, and in other ways there are arguments on both sides. There's no question in my mind about that. And then there's the third issue. Issue number one, they're talking past each other. Issue number two, there are credible arguments on both sides. And then issue number three is totally beside the point of the decisions, which is what difference does this really make? Affirmative action, it affected about, as I understand, it affected about 2 to 3% of African Americans who are attending college. 3 out of every 5 colleges in our country don't even have affirmative action. And where a large number of African Americans attend college, like community colleges, they're just open admission. So then there's this separate question of, is this much ado about nothing? Which is to say, is it about elite and selective schools, which in the grand scheme of things don't have much of an impact on most minorities in our country? Obviously that's a totally separate question because they don't really address it, except for the claim repeatedly made by Ketanji Brown Jackson that affirmative action can, and does and will have a big impact in reducing racial disparities. But I would say that's an assertion without evidence. There are many assertions that are made in these cases which are not evidence, they're just claims. And without going into the nitty-gritty right now, because we have to really start from the beginning. Without going to the nitty-gritty right now, there are many contradictions in what these folks are saying. One contradiction, I think, on the pro-affirmative action side, which is to say, Elena Kagan, Ketanji Brown Jackson, and Sonia Sotomayor. One contradiction, in my opinion, is they keep saying that race is just one tiny factor in an admission decision. That it's just of really minuscule weight. So they'll say in North Carolina, because it concerns two schools, University of North Carolina, UNC, and Harvard, because the affirmative action programs in both schools were challenged. And they claim, let's say in the University of North Carolina, they use 40 different criteria. And of those 40 criteria, says Ketanji Brown Jackson, race is only one criterion of the 40. Okay? Now, there seems to me a huge discrepancy between all the claims they make about the vital necessity of affirmative action on the one hand, and their claim on the other hand that in fact this affirmative action criteria of race only constitutes the tiniest fraction of the final decision whether to admit this or that student. If it's such a minuscule criterion, then how can you, on the other hand, claim that its repercussions, that is, abolishing it, its repercussions will be catastrophic? That doesn't compute. But I'm just pointing now to one claim. There are many issues that are raised, and then the question is how you as the interviewers and me as the interlocutor, how to proceed. And I would suggest that to put the ball in your court, and you choose a point of departure, and I will do my best to sort out what's going on here.
Sure. So, I mean, one of the, I guess one thing that I think a lot of people might, be confused about is what this ruling even does, because I think a lot of people are under the impression that it means that there's no sense in which you can, you can consider race, you can be, conscious of race in college admissions, and I don't think that's actually exactly what it does. From what I've seen, it says, well, what you can't do is sort of say, just like, here are 40 criteria. One of them is, that you're a member of an underrepresented group, so you get an extra point for that. As we're adding up points, says you can't do that. But it does say that there are, if you write an admissions essay and you're talking about the obstacles you've overcome, and and some of those have to do with race, that you're still allowed to take into account.
Yes, that's where I will get to in a moment, but that's where I felt they were talking past each other. So I'm going to get to that in a moment. You asked, what does the decision do and what doesn't it do, or what are its consequences and what are not its consequences? So you're going to have to allow me a brief excursus. That means aside, taking a circuitous journey. So let's go back to the original affirmative action decision. It was on Alan Bakke, who was a white male, and he brought his case against the University of California Medical School at Davis. So it's Davis Medical School. Davis Medical School, it had entering class of 100 students, and it reserved 16 places for designated minorities. And those 16 places were reserved for African Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, and Asians. Those were the four categories. And it was a quota. It was self-identified as a quota. For 16 places, whites were not eligible. And Bakke brought a lawsuit saying that he was being deprived of his 14th Amendment right. The 14th Amendment speaks to what's called equal protection under the law. It's often abbreviated as the Equal Protection Clause of our Constitution. And he said he was being denied his equal protection under the law because his application was superior to those of several minorities who were admitted under that quota system. So the case goes to the Supreme Court, and as has been said, the ruling of the court is, they call it fractured, because the court ruled, one, that the University of California Davis affirmative action program was unconstitutional because it had a quota system, and therefore it denied equal protection under the law. On the other hand, the court ruled that affirmative action is permissible, but only under one circumstance. So Justice Powell, Lewis Powell, wrote the majority opinion. It's complicated what happened. I'm not going to go into the details. And please don't start sending me 10,000 emails telling me I don't know what I'm talking about. I know what I'm talking about. I'm just not going to go into all the fine details. I'm giving you the general picture. Justice Powell decides as follows. He says there are 4 basic reasons why you might have affirmative action. Reason number 1, just to have what you might call a Bennington ad type class, that you should have variety of races in the class. So it's just strictly having racial representation. Powell says that's unconstitutional, clearly under the 14th Amendment, because it's not colorblind. Colorblindness is the famous interpretation of the 14th Amendment by Justice Harlan in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which we're not going to talk right now about. So he says just racial representation, unconstitutional. A second possibility, he says, is affirmative action, which you'll all recognize, affirmative action to rectify for historical wrongs. So because of the historical injustices that African Americans have suffered, we should use affirmative action to rectify the historical wrong. Justice Powell says, no, we can't do that. He says, first of all, how far back are we supposed to go with historical injustice? Where is the beginning of this rectification process? Number 2, he says, it's the nature of American society. What he says, it's not a 2-class history. It's not just white oppressor and black oppressed. He said our history is a history of immigrants where different groups suffered oppression when they came here, and then they gradually worked out of their oppression and joined the majority in oppressing another group. So he says the Irish, the Italians, the Jews. So he says we can't know which groups should and shouldn't benefit from affirmative action if we use that standard, historical oppression. He also says we can't use the standard of current racial oppression as a grounds for affirmative action, because he says it's constantly changing. that groups which were, let's say, take the Baki University of California Davis case. So they classified as one of the oppressed groups Asians. But now Asians are far outstripping any other minority, and majority, by the way, whites, in their academic performance.
Yeah,
So
in a sense, right? I mean, like I think my understanding is that Asians have the largest gap, within the group, between the poorest and the richest members, out of any racial group in the United States right now. So, some Asians are, and if you haven't, if you're just kind of putting it all the statistical grinder, it looks like it.
I'm just looking now at the academic representation.
Yeah.
There is credible evidence that, say, at Harvard, if it were strictly meritocratic criteria that are used in the narrowest sense, SAT scores, grade point average, and so forth, Harvard would be 40% Asian now.
Mm-hmm.
As of now, it's 20%, but it would probably double. At least that argument has been made, and it seems to be credible. In any case, for those reasons, which I've already stated, namely, where do we begin the historical oppression? Which groups do we include? And how do we deal with the fact that there's a constant shuffling of who is oppressed and who isn't? We have a whole, since Bhakti, there's been a whole bunch of new groups which are claiming oppression. And there are groups which have not much of a credible claim anymore. I would say South Asians, for example, Pakistanis, they're just doing fine academically. So their claim to rectifying historical oppression doesn't really seem to ring very true. Obviously, same applies to Jews. So to make that long story short, he rules out rectifying historical wrongs and trying to compensate for current racism. So that's 2 down. The third possibility is to have affirmative action because minorities are more likely to serve in minority neighborhoods. So the first Baki case was about doctors. It was medical school. And the claim was made that a minority going through medical school would more likely serve in an underserved minority neighborhood. Powell rules that out. He says there's no evidence that if you're black, you're more likely to serve in the black neighborhood. We should use your record of community service rather than your race as a proxy for your likelihood to serve in a poor neighborhood. And that left, so that's 3 down. Powell says no, no, no. And that left one possibility. And the one possibility was diversity. And namely, there is a educational value to having people of diverse backgrounds in a university because it's the feely, touchy stuff. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. I'm not going to argue at this point. But you get to learn about other people, and it breaks down stereotypes, and you learn to work together, so on and so forth. It's I would call it, for lack of a better term, it's the kumbaya version of affirmative action. And Powell says that's credible, and therefore we will allow for affirmative action, but we will limit it to only that use of affirmative action. And the reason for that is because any color or racial test, says Powell, along with several other judges, any racial or color test is in violation of that equal rights, equal protection 14th Amendment. And so we have in the United States a concept called strict scrutiny. And strict scrutiny simply means that if there is a statute, if there is a practice that's violating on its face the 14th Amendment, we have to look very closely whether that practice or that statute is constitutionally permissible. And for it to become constitutionally permissible, it has to meet two criteria. Criterion number one, it has to serve a critical state interest. There has to be a real state interest in violating the 14th Amendment. And number two, that your program for meeting this state interest has to be very narrowly tailored so that it's only serving that interest and not doing more harm. And Powell rules that diversity meets the strict scrutiny standard. Okay, now let's fast forward to the ruling last week. The ruling last week goes as follows. Justice Roberts focuses entirely on the question of diversity, and he denies that the Harvard or the UNC, University of North Carolina, the Harvard or the UNC programs, affirmative action programs, he denies that they serve the purposes of diversity. Why, I'll get to in a moment. The dissenters do something different. They claim that we have a society which is saturated with racial disparities, of which all of you know, everybody listening, and you two in particular, you know the whole story. Disparities in health, disparities in wealth, disparities in this, that, and the other. And they want to argue that affirmative action should be used to eliminate or help eliminate those disparities. Well, you can already see there's a problem here, because Roberts claims that Justice Powell already said you can't use affirmative actions to correct for historical wrongs. You can only use affirmative action for diversity. That's the only grounds, he said. And so they, Ketanji Brown Jackson and Sotomayor, are trying to effectively undo what Powell said in his opinion in the Bakke case. So I would say that it's hard to defend on legal grounds what Ketanji Brown Jackson and Sotomayor were arguing, that we can use affirmative action in order to help eliminate those racial disparities. So they have a weak case there. On the other hand, Justice Roberts wants to say, or does say, that diversity is not a legitimate grounds for affirmative action. Well, Powell said it was. So both of them are trying to undo the precedent. I think both of their cases are, at least in terms of the Bakke case, both of their briefs, opinions are kind of weak. Now, having said that, I can continue and explain why.
I do want to switch gears a little bit here, because I mean, I went back and read the part of your book where you're talking about affirmative action, and it seemed like you were a little ambivalent there. Like I kind of came out of it feeling maybe a little bit unclear about what you thought should happen, right? I mean, not like maybe taking like a little bit of a step aside, from what the immediate legal arguments were here. Um, and I do also, wonder, I mean, kind of connected it to something that you said sort of at the beginning of your comments about this, about how, you can question once you take a step back from all of this, you can question what's really at stake in practice, right? So um, there's a article about this in the Atlantic by our friend Bertrand Cooper, who points out that it's the failure of affirmative action. And he says, for the Black poor, a world without affirmative action is just the world as it is. That in other words.
Well, I'll just give you one example, and then I want to reach the practical questions and hear you. I want to hear you out. This is not a monologue, but just a practical example. Harvard has 600. I'm not going to say African Americans because that's the whole point. They don't have African Americans. 600 Black people in their school right now. Of those 600, 200 are from Nigeria. There's a Harvard Nigerian Association, 200 members, which is to say 1/3 of Harvard's affirmative action diversity consists of Nigerians who are basically getting into Harvard because they belong to the ruling class in Nigeria and they bring a lot of money. Now you have to ask yourself a simple question. Does that speak to the purposes of affirmative action? I think it speaks to how to make Harvard rich.
Richer.
Bringing the sons and daughters of a very rich country, an oil-rich country, bringing them all to Harvard, claiming, look how enlightened and progressive we are, whereas beneath the veneer of being enlightened and progressive, it's a get-rich scheme for Harvard. I remember Brianna Joy Gray commented. She said, in her entering class at Harvard, there were 150 Black students, which is right because it's 600 altogether. And she said of those 150, she said only 10% represented anything having to do with my background.
What does she mean by her background, though? She was like Black from
Black from America. That's what she means, right?
From a modest background. Her father was a science teacher, I think a high school science teacher. Her mother did work for the UN as I think a psychologist, if my memory is correct. And she spent a lot of time out of the country. 8 years, she said, in her formative years. 8 years was spent outside the country. But she's coming from coming from the American South. And she was not part of the what was called back then, I don't know what's called now, the Black bourgeoisie. That was not her background. And she said only 10%.
What were you saying before, Jason?
I mean, Bertram Cooper points out in that article, because he actually did a lot of work. He had to work with Harvard to get the whole thing published, and he actually wanted to pull records from there because he's been working on this a book about this actually for quite some time, because he actually comes from a very Black poor background where he went to high school. He was in the foster care system while he was in high school. His father was in prison for a large part of his life, and then his mother was just off doing her own thing. So, the idea that Brianna Joy says, well, there's a lot of people that came from my background. It's like, well, you mean people that lived in Africa for 8 years of their life, like Mean Girls? Or do you mean, Black working poor? Because I think that's only 3% of of the population, and the white poor is definitely not represented at Harvard whatsoever. So his whole point of the piece is for the ending of affirmative, and he wrote this before the verdict came down, for the affirmative action to be over for black and brown, poor people. That's just the world that they live in, or we live in. Nothing has changed. This does not mean anything to the majority of us. So yes, she is 100% right that Harvard went out and got, all these dignitaries' kids, and they have perfect racial representation because of that.
So go ahead. No, go ahead.
No. So the question around Harvard and elite institutions, is just kind of funny. I mean, not everybody with a 4.0 is getting into an elite institution, right? We all know that. Like this is really hard to get in. That's why they're elite institutions, because
nobody would want a degree from Harvard if they weren't so rare.
There's a reason why Harvard and UMass are different schools.
Yeah, no, exactly. If they did, I wrote an article for Jackman a couple of years ago where I said I want to nationalize these universities, and we could make it UMass Cambridge, at which point it won't be special. It'll just be the UMass that people go to if they live close to there. But right now, one of the main purposes that's served by this school is to get to say, oh, I'm one of the tiny number of people who's a member of this club, who went to the school that almost nobody gets to go to, and that in itself, I think, maybe speaks to a limit of the way that this is such a charged sort of way that people talk about racial justice or overcoming disparities, like Norm was mentioning about the dissents, that I think it might speak to the sort of unspoken class dimension of identity politics as it actually exists in the United States, that we end up focusing so much on what happens in these elite institutions.
Yeah, there's a certain segment of the black population that through affirmative action got in better positions, but it's not like it lifted a vast majority out of poverty, and I think that's where people are kind of missing the point a lot on this.
Well, I would have to say I happen to respect Ketanji Brown Jackson. I think she's an impressive woman, very significant achievements, and she acquits herself with a lot of dignity and intelligence. And for me, it's deserving of respect. I was disappointed by her dissent. It was well written, very well researched, no question on those grounds. But I was a little disappointed that she adopted as her own that very limited vision of woke politics, namely, we have to get rid of the disparities. As if to say, if every black person can live like a white person, this country would be so wonderful. Well, for 80% of Americans...
live like which white people?
For 80% of Americans, if 80% of black people live like the 80% of white people, it's no great shakes. And so to me, it bespoke a very limited, cramped vision of what is the desirable outcome for our country. Is it just to eliminate disparities so 80% are basically facing a futureless future? Is that the goal? So that to me was a bit of a disappointment. I would say that and the question, and I'll hear you out. I'll just lay out the arguments, and then I would be happy to hear from both of you. How credible do you find the arguments that Roberts made against the diversity claim? So I'm going to just go through them 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll list one, and then you respond. So give you an opportunity to weigh in. So number one. Robert says a lot of these goals, like we're learning to work together. We're learning to get over our stereotypes. We're learning to be future leaders in which we can get along with each other. He says these are such what he calls imponderable goals, there's no way to measure whether you're achieving something or you're not achieving something. Because in order to pass strict scrutiny, you have to show that if we're going to violate the 14th Amendment, the colorblind clause, as it's called, you have to show that something is being accomplished. And he says I'm using my terms now, not his. He says these kinds of feely-touchy criteria, learning to get along, learning to respect each other, and he says those are too imprecise, too imponderable to be a basis for an affirmative action program. I have to say, now here you can disagree with me. You can disagree with me on anything. I do have to say, I find it kind of like turning black people into animals in the zoo. Like, we have to learn how to get along with them. And that's why we have affirmative action. It leaves me uncomfortable, that kind of depiction of the purpose of affirmative action. The fact of the matter is, most white people have some interaction with black people virtually every day, whether it's on the subway, on the bus, somewhere in the workplace, you're the person at the post office, somewhere you're having interaction. I'm not sure if you really have much more interaction in the college campus. You know, college campuses can be awfully segregated places. If you ever go into the lunchroom in many college campuses or the dinner room, they're very segregated places. So that criteria, I kind of agreed with Roberts that that's too feely touchy. That's my term. Then he said the categories that are used to judge diversity. He says these categories are totally arbitrary. So there's one category called Asians, okay? But it makes no distinction between South Asians, like Pakistanis or Bangladeshis, and East Asians, like Chinese. They just have one lump category called Asians. And we have to have, for diversity, we have to have representation from Asians. Then he says there's another category, it's called Hispanics. But Hispanics include people from Spain. It includes people from Latin America. It doesn't include Brazil. So what is this category? And then he says there's whole groups which are not even part of diversity. For example, there's no Middle East category. So
they fall under Asians?
No, that would be Egyptians, Iranians, Jordanians.
Yeah, aren't they all Asian?
No, they're Middle Eastern, and they don't pass in the Asian category. So he says all of these categories that are used are so arbitrary. And then he makes the point, which we've already mentioned. He says it includes somebody from an impoverished background in the South and a Nigerian head of state, the
dignitaries' kids.
Yeah. He says, is that a substantial category if it includes people so different in virtually every regard, except for being black? And then he says this whole notion of diversity is based on stereotypes. So it assumes if we have X number of blacks on campus, we'll have the black voice. But that assumes there's one black voice.
You didn't know that? It's Mahalia Jackson.
Actually, I'll agree with that.
Was there a vote?
Yeah, we all voted for Mahalia Jackson, and that
you could see how untenable that view is, because there are two African Americans on the Supreme Court now, and Justice Thomas, devotes most of his concurring opinion to attacking Ketanji Brown Jackson, while Ketanji Brown Jackson replies that Justice Thomas obviously hasn't a clue what he's talking about. So I put in the margins, ouch. So, but that just belies the claim that having a Black person on campus adds to the mix, because it provides the Black perspective.
But it's it's back to that whole thing about Brianna talking about no one's representing her. It's like, but what Black perspective are you getting, right? It's not the George Floyd Black perspective of someone that grew up in projects. It's the Black perspective of, even if you're a Black American, you're fitting in with your Harvard friends. Ben and I, this is all anecdotal, Ben and I were at a friend's wedding that's part of my show, and he went to Harvard, and all of his Harvard friends were there. None of them looked like, they were all white, and they were all pretty well-to-do. Like that hasn't really changed. And people that go to that school, you're putting yourself in elite company for a particular reason. I don't know why people feel like Harvard is Good Will Hunting is a movie. Like, let that shit go.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think the first Robert's point, I think is pretty well taken. That I'm not sure that I think that trying to foster, like, what goes on in somebody's head, I don't think should necessarily be the goal of public policy. I'm concerned with what people have and if their material needs are being met and what kind of legal rights they have and all of that stuff. But, the thoughts in their head, I think there's a limited amount public policy can do about it in the first place. And, and it's hard to know all of that stuff. All that stuff seems right. And most of the other objections, frankly, seem right too. I mean, if the goal is not diversity, but overcoming disparities, that's a better argument, but you can still, even though it goes against the original Powell decision you're talking about, but it's a better argument. Although even there, if that was the goal, I would question whether the kind of affirmative action that existed before the ruling would really be an effective way of achieving it, because if the underlying disparity is about, it's not, the disparity is not that like fewer middle class and rich like Black kids go to college than middle class and rich white kids. That's not really the disparity, right? The disparity is who is in those categories in the first place, right? That who grows up in those backgrounds, who grows up in poverty. That's really the disparity. And I wonder if that really was the goal. If if affirmative action that was just based on family income level would be
this conversation can't happen.
That actually is perfectly, first of all, it's perfectly legal. The 14th Amendment and what's called Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it forbids discrimination for anyone who's Title VI, anyone who's a recipient of federal funding, based on race, color, national origin, and then they added sex and religion. But there's nothing stops schools from having class-based affirmative action. In fact, there was an interesting article yesterday in the New York Times. The original place where the whole affirmative action became litigated, as I said, was University of California, Davis. And now Davis, I should say the medical school at Davis, they have adopted a affirmative action program based entirely on class. They eliminated race, and they substitute for it. If you come from a poor background, if you came, or if you suffered growing up for this, that, or the other reason based on class factors, that's their affirmative action program. And interestingly enough, I was surprised to learn that even though a lot of folks are admitted on the basis of that affirmative action, a class-based affirmative action, they said that the MCAT scores did not only diminished marginally, which is to say they were able to find lots of poor kids who actually did well in their standardized exam, and they were admitted. So it's perfectly possible to make a class-based affirmative action program. And I think I'll tell you something. I teach Baki, or I taught Baki. Now I'm going to have to teach this new one, which I'm filled with dread because it's going to take so much work to figure out how to present it. That's a separate issue. The students in my class, minority students, I teach at City University, so it's mostly first-generation immigrant and African-American students. Just a smattering of white students, 2 or 3 in a class of 30, 35. And I was surprised. Most of the minority students opposed affirmative action. They opposed it. And I think the feeling was, when you're a first-generation immigrant or you're African-American, most of your friends are not in college. This is a real achievement. And they're working hard. The students work hard. And they want to be rewarded for their effort. And they don't accept that you should be rewarded just for being a minority.
But isn't that part of a campaign that was extremely strong in the 80s? So, bringing back the Benetton ad that you brought up for some people that didn't remember. But for people that don't know, Benetton is a Gap-like company that sold earth tones in the 80s and had advertisements where there were multicultural ads all the time. But isn't everything you're saying right now kind of an internalization of a lot of the Reagan era talking points that we heard about the ideas of affirmative action and what was really happening? Because this also what I heard being, I think it was just out of high school when Proposition 187 went down in California in like 1997. I think that happens. And I remember hearing the same things about people getting into these universities only because of filling racial quotas. And it happened in California in the 90s. It wasn't that long ago. People always look at where I'm from as some sort of liberal paradise that is somewhat recent, that California was blue. It gives us Reagan and Nixon, so let's not forget that.
Nixon and Schwarzenegger.
Yeah. Like I said, don't forget Reagan. There's a lot of wonderful right wingers that come from my beautiful state. But I feel like that is kind of a sad internalization of talking points that maybe even their family internalized from that era as well, because there was a lot of shame in that moment of what these programs meant and the way they were being presented. Because you still have to have a certain level of like basic skills. It's not just like you're pulling any black person to go to these.
And one of the things that Norm mentioned earlier in the conversation is that something like 2/3 of colleges weren't using affirmative action.
3/5.
3/5. Okay. Yeah. In the first place, which is sort of unsurprising because most universities aren't trying to come up with like tiny ways to differentiate nearly equivalent candidates for a tiny number of spots. Most universities are trying to, make sure that you meet some academic qualifications, but I mean, but they're admitting most people who apply. I mean, it's the I think, right. I mean, I'm open to being corrected about this, but I think that this is primarily a phenomenon of relatively elite universities, or at least relatively elite programs at other universities, because those are the cases where you have this huge pool of people who all check all of these boxes to be admitted. And to quote a friend of ours who, I don't know if he didn't say this in the public record, so I'll just quote him anonymously. It's like you get down to the point where you're rejecting people for chipped fingernails and things like that, right? That like because you have so many people who meet all of your standards, who are applying for the same tiny number of boxes, and that's where affirmative action is going to be the biggest deal. Is it those universities? And I also, I mean, this is also something that I guess gives me a little bit of pause about the whole discussion. This is something that Freddie DeBoer wrote something in his Substack about affirmative action. This is one of the points that he made, that, both when we consider people who got in, who maybe would not have gotten one of those slots, if not for affirmative action, and then somebody who's like a white kid who, let's say they didn't get in because that was something they didn't get a point for, because of affirmative action. Both of those people, just to be a little bit crass about this, are basically going to be fine. That they're not like
the backup school is still USC, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like nobody's, there are very few people in the world who it's like, well, okay, if I don't get into Harvard, I guess I'll go to Lansing Community College.
That's not how that's working, right?
Yeah.
Like let's be honest. There's also, it's funny you talk about the spots taken. I don't know if you guys remember the college admission scandal from a few years ago,
yes,
which sadly I felt like didn't get the amount of coverage that it really should have gotten, because one of the things was the guy that was kind of behind it, or one of the people that was behind it, had a whole program for helping underprivileged kids get into schools, and kind of, I wouldn't say it's cover exactly, but man, you're also a part of this whole thing that's hurting people that are on the cusp of getting in, that are poor and working class. They were losing their spots to people that were getting this kind of side door entrance. They weren't rich enough to be Jared Kushner rich, where your parents are going to get a building built in your name, right? They were paying still hundreds of thousands of dollars to get their kids in. What was it? Cal, USC. I don't even think there was any Ivies in it, right? Was Princeton one of them, or Columbia? I don't remember.
However, 5% of the applications, 5% are either legacies, meaning your parent attended, or big donors, like Jared Kushner's father, or athletes. So we have big donors, athletes, and faculty and staff children. They constitute 5% of applicants and 30% of those accepted.
Damn.
30% of those accepted on totally, completely unmeritocratic grounds. I mean, that is rich, or mommy's rich, or you're a good athlete, or you're a faculty and staff child. Now, here's an interesting fact about this Supreme Court decision. Do you know who went after the legacies exception to meritocracy the most? I was very surprised. Gorsuch.
Really?
I don't know why. I was just really surprised. Gorsuch was the one who devoted most of his concurring opinion to denouncing the special privileges of the rich. The only thing I could figure was he wanted to show up the hypocrisy of Harvard, that it pretends to be so liberal and so progressive. We want to have Black people in our school. Yeah, you're so liberal and you're so progressive that you tilt the whole playing field to serve the children of rich donors and legacy children. Yeah, so I was surprised. Sotomayor mentions it in passing, but the one who really ripped into that whole scandal, as on today's headline, the Times was, that now there's a new campaign afoot. Since you got rid of affirmative action, let's get rid of legacies. And it'll be interesting to see whether that takes off. There are demonstrations at Harvard today to get rid of the legacy thing. So we'll see. Another thing which is, I won't call it troubling, I will call it the narrowness of vision of the so-called progressives. Do you know what one of Sotomayor's arguments was? One of her arguments was, if we have affirmative action, it'll make our military more efficient. And then you know what her example was? Her example was, back during the war in Vietnam, all of the soldiers were black and the officers were white. And that was one of the reasons why it wasn't an efficient fighting force. So we can have more black people in the senior positions. Our armed forces will be.
So next time around, if we have a wildly unpopular imperialist war, then there's going to be less resistance to it from within the military.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Get these radical blacks out there with, we need more black 4-star generals. That's what we need.
I couldn't help but think, Justice Sotomayor, I don't think the problem with the Vietnam War was the army wasn't efficient enough. I could think of other problems with
You
that.
didn't read Spike Lee's, or not Spike Lee's book, the guy that wrote the book Bloods. Apparently that's what it was all about. Not enough black representation in upper management in the fleet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Another interesting fact was you could just feel the visceral hatred between these judges. So, justices. So I'll give you an example. Obviously, Sotomayor is completely out of control. She's out of control. She sort of reminds me of myself. But you can imagine, I wouldn't be a good fit for the Supreme Court. So, Justice Roberts, he makes one exception to his abolition of affirmative action. And that exception was what Ben already alluded to. He says that your race in and of itself should not be a factor in admissions. However, if you can demonstrate that overcoming a racial obstacle was a significant achievement in your life, you can write about it in your essay, and that would be legitimate grounds for admission. That is to say, it's not enough that you suffer, or it's not enough that you're of a racial group. You have to demonstrate some personal achievement in overcoming that racial identity, and then you can use that. So Sotomayor, she describes Roberts' single exception. She describes it as, quote, putting lipstick on a pig.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.